Welcome to the first WOW Weber on Wednesday program. During the month of May, the library celebrates not only National Historic Preservation Month and local history, but Irving Weber. You might ask, why do we call our local history programming Weber Days? It's because Irving Weber, who you can see his face in 8 different renditions over there, Irving Weber's legacy in Iowa City and the role he had in helping preserve the past. He lived his entire life, almost the 20th century, in Iowa City. His family roots reached deep into early Iowa City. His maternal grandparents settled in Iowa City in 1839. His paternal grandparents came to town in 1857. He was born in 1900. The momentous beginning of a new century. He was educated in Iowa City public schools and graduated from the University of Iowa in 1922. He's remembered for many things. He was the University of Iowa's first All-American swimmer. He was the founder of Quality Check Dairies and served as its president until his retirement in 1966. He was an active member of the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club, the group that printed those 8 volumes. And he was a local school board president from 1952 to 53. In 1994, Irving B. Weber Elementary School was named in his honor. Irving Weber may be most remembered, at least for us. I think people who are newer to Iowa City and aren't familiar with him don't realize that he wrote over 800 articles for the Iowa City Press-Citizen, beginning in 1973, 7 years after he retired. He had a long view of history, and it was one of not a dull retelling of facts and names, not that that's what historians do at all, but he told what it was like to grow up in Iowa City, the best places to buy penny candy, the joys of cooling off in Melrose Lake in the summer, and of sledding parties on closed-off streets. He recorded for future generations the story of Iowa City as no one else could. In 1989, in gratitude for his work in recording local history, Irving B. Weber was named Iowa City's official historian. All of the articles Irving Weber wrote for the Iowa City Press-Citizen are available online at the University of Iowa Digital Library through the cooperation of the Host Noon Lions Club, the Iowa City Public Library, and Lolly Eggers, the former library director. Irving Weber died in 1997, barely missing a century of life. I have a little introduction to tonight's program, University Town, Union Town, an introduction to Iowa City and Johnson County's labor history. John McKerley is the oral and public historian at the University of Iowa Labor Center's Iowa Labor History Oral Project. John is also an adjunct assistant professor in the University of Iowa Department of History. His research and teaching focus on social movements in the United States since the Civil War, with particular emphasis on labor and working class history, broadly defined. He is co-editor of a collection of essays on the labor tradition of engaged scholarship that is forthcoming from the University of Illinois. Already published from the University of Illinois. In 2013, John took a position as the oral historian with the Iowa Labor History Oral Project at the UI Labor Center. With over 12,000 interviews, the Iowa Labor History Oral Project constitutes one of the largest and longest running and most significant labor-focused oral history collections in the world. And I was looking for information on labor history, and particularly in Iowa with all of the changes that were happening in the Iowa State House. And so I was trying to find somebody in Iowa City who could do this, and I came upon John's name, and I wrote him an email, and I thought, can you do, is there enough labor history in Iowa City and in Johnson County? And so I wrote that, and I said, if there isn't, anything on Iowa would work. And he wrote back immediately, very enthusiastically, and said, oh, I can do it. There's a lot to tell. So please help me in welcoming John McKerley.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, I very much appreciate the folks who are here. I hear that I'm up against a lecture about Governor Branstad and his trip to China, so I'm very appreciative of the folks who are here. Just a few quick remarks before I begin. So one of the reasons I was able to respond so enthusiastically was that I had actually, while I was in graduate school at the university, written a book just to make ends meet during a summer as a graduate student for a union here in town, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners Local 1260, which is going to figure very prominently in here. And so it was through researching and writing a centennial history for that local that I became very familiar with the labor history of Iowa City and of Johnson County. And so again, I just want to provide just a sort of slight thesis for what I'm going to propose here, which is that we oftentimes when we think of a union town, we tend to think in terms of an industrial union town, right? Even here in Iowa, we have examples of those places like Davenport, say for example, or Waterloo, or Ottumwa, places that were built around factories, whether they be farm equipment manufacturing facilities or meat packing, in particular here in Iowa. But in the process, since that is the image that is so strongly so strongly comes to mind, it allows us, however, to forget about the importance of other kinds of unions and other kinds of places in Iowa. And so here in Iowa City, we think again about the university as a major employer, and certainly of the unions that have developed here in Iowa City over the last 40 years. But what I'm going to try to demonstrate to you today is that is actually a part of a much longer history that goes back at least a century, and that involves still the university as a critical employer, but one that employs people indirectly, union workers, for again a long time before it becomes a direct employer of that labor. Okay. So first a quiz. It's almost finals week, so it seems appropriate. So these three groups: coal mines, railroads, and the building trades, and again that to the construction industry is really what that should read. Those are the places where 100 years ago, where the origins of the Iowa labor movement were found. Which of those three do you think would be the site where most of Iowa City's labor history would be found? I think I've kind of already given it away, but I'm just curious. The trades, right? Exactly. Right. So again, coal mines were a critical early source of union labor in Iowa, but again, that's in a belt that runs from Fort Dodge almost all the way to Keokuk. And again, the railroads that ran east-west across the state were also a critical source. But here in Iowa City, it's really the building trades. And so again, just to introduce you, while there, and as we're going to see, there were a number of these trades that were important in Iowa City. The one that I really want to focus on is the Carpenters Union, properly known as the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America. And I've given you here some examples of the imagery used by both the Carpenters Union and the larger federation of which it's a part in the early 20th century, the American Federation of Labor, just to give you a sense for how these early workers thought of themselves. So a couple of, well, actually, is there anything that stands out to you from this imagery? What jumps out? Any Latinists? We have a yes, labor conquers all. Labor omnia vincit. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Shake out hands. The worker is well tailored.
Ah, right. So again, what was said from the audience is that the workers is well tailored as the management. Yes. Right. So again, the two grasped hands. Both with coats and sleeves, right? If they're the hands of workers, they're clearly workers who see themselves as an elite group of workers, right? Yeah. So again, this is the starting place. So again, taking us back a century. It's important to quickly understand that where Iowa City falls within the rest of the state. So here 100 years ago, we were in the midst of an organizing boom that was coming out of what was then the Great Depression. of the 19th century, the late 19th century, which is the Depression of 1893, the 1890s. And there was a new wave of economic growth that was happening at the turn of the century out of that depression. And it was in the midst of that we see some of the early organizing in the trades, especially across the state and here in Iowa City. So again, in Dubuque, we have the founding of Local 678 in 1890, in Cedar Rapids, Local 308 in 1899, in Ottumwa, Local 767 in 1900, again here in Iowa City, Local 1260 in 1902. Okay. In a way that probably won't surprise anyone who's familiar with Iowa City history, the early origins of labor in Iowa is grounded in a very familiar part of town, right, which is Goosetown. The part of town that's associated with especially Bohemian immigrants, and of course this famous story, to what extent I'm sure someone from the audience can tell me the truth of it, but just again for the people who will be listening, the notion that Bohemian women chased their geese through the streets, and thus the moniker of Goosetown stuck. And again, I took this photograph a few years ago. Presumably these signs are still there, denoting the modern boundaries of Goosetown. But again, it was in this immigrant community, particularly amongst the Germans and the Bohemians, where you're going to find some of the early union members who are going to define the labor movement in Iowa City. And again, some familiar landmarks, right? So this building, now I believe the Purcell School of Music, was one of the early union halls. At the time, it was the Czechoslovakian Protective Society building. And again, since many of those early union members came out of that community, they used this building during the early 20th century as a labor temple. And again, here another familiar Iowa City landmark, John's Grocery, was, I'm almost certain, founded by, was a member of the Alberhaskey family, and that Alberhaskey line stretches back to a president, actually, of Local 1260 in the early 20th century. So again, much of what I'm going to be doing here is trying to connect you to what you would regard as familiar Iowa City sites that are actually also labor sites. But again, as I noted at the very beginning, one of the critical elements of this story is the university as an employer here in the early of union labor, and here in the early 20th century, not a direct employer, but an indirect one. And so here in the early 20th century, we have a huge building boom that goes on, and much of this is conducted with the skilled union labor that was available here in Iowa City. So just a few examples. So again, the original Children's Hospital, 1919, the Quadrangle, 1920, the Armory, 1921, the Psychiatric Hospital, 1921, Jessup Hall, 1924, the IMU, 1926, the Burlington Street Power Plant, 1928, and then the iconic General Hospital in 1928. So all of these would have been projects in which Local 1260 and other union building trades people would have been involved. And in fact, they often talk in the meeting minutes that still exist and that are held by the local of needing to square up state jobs. That's the phrase that rings through those meeting minutes. But again, even closer to home. So here in the 1920s, and again, there's a question mark there because I haven't been able to, the numbers have changed over the years, and I haven't been able to nail it down with precision. But in the 1920s, at 210.5 East College Street, very close to here, was again another union hall that was the center of labor life in Iowa City. And to give you a sense of who those union workers were, we have again Carpenters Local 1260, of course, the auxiliary of Carpenters Ladies Auxiliary number 136, the electrical workers, this is the IBEW, Local 590, the plumbers, Local 483 were there, the typographical workers, Local 515, and the German Aid Society, right? So again, you see how, you see the importance of these skilled trades, mostly in the building trades, but also, again, the typographical workers, the centrality of these union workers to what was then the labor movement in Iowa City. But also, again, their connection to this larger immigrant community, especially amongst the German community here in Iowa City. Okay, but again, you know, as for workers across the country, the Great Depression was a critical moment here for several reasons. So of course, we have, you know, it was a devastating time for Iowa City workers. One way to measure that, and this is something that I did in the book that I wrote in 2004, is that I was able to use financial records to chart the decline in membership in Local 1260, just to give a sense for what was happening there. And so we were able to see that from a high point of about 150 in 1926, the membership of Local 1260 drops all the way down to 11 in January of 1933. 11. And ever so slowly crawls its way back up again through the next several years. Again, in large part because of commitment and organizing on the part of those union workers, but then eventually as well, after 1935, you have, of course, the National Labor Relations Act, which for the first time provides national support for labor organizing. But it also provides, the New Deal provides some federal funds to restart some of that building campaign that was so important to the union workers, the building trades union workers here in Iowa City. And so again, you know, we have, of course, you know, over on the other side of the river, some of these buildings that date from the 1930s and that were, as far as I can tell, important to the livelihood of those union workers, again, in the 1930s. So here's just an example from one of these Local 1260 members. So this is Harry Morse reporting on his, on the report that he had delivered as a delegate to the 1935 Iowa State Building Trades Council, where he says, "Work is very good in Iowa City. We have no agreement, but plenty of work and are building up our organization." Right, so again, you know, here they haven't been able to bring contractors or presumably the university to a contract, but they are here in 1935 beginning to rebuild their organization. But again, as for most unions in the United States, it's really that period after the 1930s and the 1940s and especially the 1950s when we really see the high point for union workers. Again, we tend to think about the 1930s as this critical moment, and it was in terms of organizing, but it's not till the 1950s when you get the high point of what's called union density, of the percentage of union workers who in the overall economy who again are union members. And again, that I'm sure that's true here in the Iowa City area. And again, we have more evidence from the members themselves about just how important it was to them. And just before I read this little snapshot, the image here comes from the daughter of one of these workers who was an important member of 1260 in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Charlie Rupert. And he's a worker who he contributed an interview to the Iowa Labor History Oral Project, and his daughter donated these images from his collection, and they're available digitally through the State Historical Society. So again, here we have, in this case, Wilson Putman, a member of Local 1260, reporting, and again, this is here in the 1940s or 50s, if I recall. But he says, "I can remember when every commercial building in Iowa City was union, everything. University work was all union. Everything was top-notch men, right? So again, here, this next building boom, which I won't rehearse for you as I did the earlier one, was critical to the support for building trades union members here in Iowa City. Okay, but again, building trades work is often dangerous work, and there's a good example of it here in 1970. So I'm just going to read. This is a complicated bit, so I'm actually just going to cheat a bit and read a short passage from this book I wrote in 2004 that explains this. So this is a short passage that describes deaths that happened that happened during the construction of the first Hansher in 1970. So again, the same year that OSHA was founded to increase workplace safety, Local 1260 suffered a tragic loss from employer negligence. Shortly after 10:30 on the morning of Thursday, December 17, 1970, wooden scaffolding supporting 5 workers on the Virgil M. Hansher Auditorium project collapsed. According to the Press Citizen, 4 of the men who had been installing metal lathe and plastic sheeting near the roof fell 55 feet onto frozen ground and metal rods. 2 of the workers, Jack T. Hain and Oscar Jr. Tappan, were killed instantly. Although a mud-choked road leading to the construction site slowed rescue efforts, emergency medical personnel succeeded in delivering a critically injured Frank Miller and Glenn A. Hereen to the UI hospital. Hain, Miller, and Hereen were carpenters, and Tappan was a union laborer. A 4th carpenter, Jerry St. Ange, prevented himself from falling by hanging on to the shattered scaffolding until an iron worker, Larry Savage, could rescue him. University architect George Horner told the Press Citizen that the 2 deaths were the first fatalities on construction work I can remember in the 40 years I've been here. Foreman stopped work on the site until Monday out of respect for the dead. So again, this event here in 1970 actually ends up causing a brief stir because there's a controversy over the installation of this hanging scaffolding that ends up collapsing around these workers. And again, the details are complicated, and I won't get into them. But ultimately, actually, one of those workers who was critically injured, who'd been taken to the hospital, he ultimately dies. So the death toll rises to 3. There's not ultimately much in the way of prosecution, but you do get a memorial that's erected largely through the efforts of workers themselves and their supporters that was set up near the site of the original Hansher. And honestly, I was asking around today because I haven't been out to the new site whether or not that memorial still exists in the site of the new Hansher. But I did take these photographs at the destruction of the old building, and I'm pretty sure that the girders that you can see there are at the very least the kind of place where that scaffolding would have hung when it fell in 1970. Okay, but it's not all tragedy, of course, and it's also not all men. So an important part of this story takes place in the 1970s through a woman named Dale McCormack, who was she had been born in New York, came to Iowa with her mother, who remarried into a family of Iowa Democratic Party activists. And Dale grew up, went to the University of Iowa in the late 60s, early 70s, and became involved in a variety of forms of activism, especially with regard to women's rights and to the gay and lesbian rights movement in the 1970s at the university. And after being at the university for a while, she ends up she's living in a communal living situation in Iowa City, and she realizes, well, I need a job. I need a job to help support this commune. And she says, well, I should go and get a job as a union carpenter. It's something that I've always been interested in. And one it's great wages that can help support this commune, and two, I'm going to go and strike a blow against the patriarchy. I mean, that was really quite how she thought of it. I've done an interview with her for the Iowa Labor History Oral Project, and I just want to play a brief selection from that because I think it's a wonderful example of just a wonderful little window into Iowa City labor here in the early 1970s.
This is a funny story, too, when I think about it. So it was getting to me, definitely, building anger and graffiti in the porta potty. So Friday afternoon, they hung a picture.
And actually, let me set it up a little bit better than I did, which is that she's experiencing harassment here on the job site, right? In some cases, even from other union members. She has her allies within the union, but there are plenty of people even within the union who don't want her there. And so what she's describing here is the kind of day-to-day harassment that she's experienced and the way that she fights back.
Playboy pinup, and it was winter, so we all were in the warm-up shack. This was in the warm-up shack in the middle. And so I just lost it. Because they were placating me with boys will be boys. Don't let them get to you, Dale. And I'd say, well, they are getting to me. So I come in 4:30 on Friday, find this pinup, and I just lost it. And I took my hammer out of my belt, really. Okay, I'm telling you that I lost it. Took my hammer out of my belt. I stomped out to the superintendent's trailer, and I went in, and his name was Tom. He's called me since. And he has fond memories of this. And I said, Tom, are you going to stop this? He said, oh, they put up another pinup, didn't they? And I said, yes, they did. What are you going to do about it? Oh, boys will be boys, So I marched back in. I had my hammer in my right hand, and I come up to Billy, well, I forget his name, what big laborer guy. And I took him by his T-shirt. He's up there, right? I'm down here. And I held my hammer out and I said, are you the one that's putting up those pinups in my hat and coat? Where hang my hat and coat? And he said, oh, no, it's not me. So I let him go, and I marched into the warm-up shack, and I announced to everybody, there was maybe, 5 to 10 guys standing around, and I said, okay, which one of you guys is putting up these pinups? And they went, no, it's not me. It's not. Of course, it was this other guy and his brother. And so I said, we had a picnic table and there was a bench, and all of our lunch boxes were lined up there. And this was the days of glass thermoses. So I took my hammer and I said, well, this shit has got to stop. And I whammed my hammer down onto just anybody's lunch box, and there was broke the thermos. And it turns out it was Ron Rayner, who was one of them. I called him my arch prick rival, who was the leader, or he said it was his. So he came over to me, and he's 6'2", and he poking at me. He said, "You better get me a new lunchbox by Monday." And so I had run out of good lines and steam by that time. So I just said, well, this shit has got to stop. And I stomped out. And I went down to the City Hall. And because I knew that I couldn't continue at that level of anger and frustration. And so I went in to the Human Rights Commission, was there. And there was a secretary. It was Friday, right? Everybody's gone. There was a secretary there. And I said, well, it's not like I don't have the job. I have the job and everything, but they're putting up these dirty pictures in my hat and coat, and I don't think, she said, that's illegal. Here, sign this, sign this, sign this. She had me file with the EEOC, the state, and the local. And they found, of course, in my favor, and there was a settlement. I didn't get any money, but I'm trying to think of the name of the company. It started with a K, but
Knutson?
yes, Knutson. Who, guess what? Had an affirmative action officer, Pedro Ramos. Where was old Pedro while all this is happening, you know? How come I didn't know? How come I didn't know about Pedro? So that was one of the things I wanted, was that there's posters put up about what their philosophy was, and if you were having trouble, and blah blah blah. So then what happened, though? This is fascinating. So it was the smartest thing I ever did, was file this, because when they found in my favor, in other words, the probable cause that I had been harassed and discriminated against, it was like I had this bubble. I was existing in this bubble of federal protection. And so I walked around, and it drove Ron Rayner absolutely nuts. And they changed their harassment from that to, well, I wish that the state would pay for my lawyer, you know. And I would just pull my hard hat down over my eyes in a cocky little way and said, yeah, that's pretty good, huh? You know, he couldn't touch me. It was wonderful. I finished my apprenticeship because of that.
Okay, so again, I appreciate your patience with that, but again, I think that's just a wonderful moment that not only is it just a wonderful story, but it's a great moment in which you see the intertwining of, in many ways, those older traditions. You know, again, you know, as I said, you know, Dale here, you know, she very much appreciated the skill that she had learned, and also the union wages that she was able to earn. But at the same time, she was confronting older traditions, in her case of misogyny, you know, against which a newer generation of workers was beginning to push, and whose concerns were going to begin to shape new forms of union organizing in the next several decades, right? So she forms this very interesting sort of pivot point. She was the first woman to join 1260, definitely. You know, she is right. She's and the question was she the first woman to join the union? And so again, you know, in 1260, yes. And as I say, you know, she had both opponents and allies. You know, there were people within the union, even older people, who came with an older, people from the old left, in many cases, who were her allies within the union, as well as people from the new left, who were her allies. And so there were a variety of different kinds of traditions that combined to both support and oppose her within the institution of the union. But she's also a member, right, there are many women like Dale during this period all across the union, all across the nation, who are beginning to press against those old boundaries, right, and to redefine who is a union member, who's a worker. So again, I want to pick up on this thread. So because in many ways this is the pivot point that I was speaking of, and to the point, to the place that we in many ways find ourselves today, and to the forms of labor organizing with which here in Iowa City with which you might be more familiar. So of course, you know, here in Iowa City, well, and actually let me back up and say that it's also here in the 1970s when we get an important new law, the Iowa Public Employment Relations Law, which was enacted in 1974 through the efforts of union members across the state, especially from within the public school teachers. But again, from a variety of different unions, both public and private, that pushed for this law in the 1970s, but that once it was enacted in 1974, opened up a whole new field of organizing, especially on the Regents campuses. Amongst the first union members to organize were the a variety of different staff members at the university who organized into the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. They actually forged a coalition between a much older union that had existed well back into the 1940s amongst the maintenance staff, especially on the campus, but that had existed in this period in which there was no formalized bargaining, with a newer group of employees, many of whom were made up of students who had been, I should say, students at the university, experienced this period of heightened politicization during the late 60s, early 70s, and then went in and became university employees, again, in the early 1970s. And so these lines, again, joined here in the late 1970s in the organization of AFSCME here on campus. 3 decades later, we have graduate students in the 1990s, 2 decades later, organizing the campaign to organize graduate students. And again, you know, this was a line that stretched all the way back at least to the 1960s, when graduate students had at least considered the idea, but never made much of it. And there had been a variety of different attempts between then and the early 1990s, when finally in 1996, graduate employees succeeded in organizing what becomes COGS. And then 3 years later, we have the nurses at the University Hospital organizing into the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. So again, you know, we have, you know, here in the 1970s, we have the combination of a new law that provides a whole new group of Iowa workers to seize legal collective bargaining. And then over the next several decades, we see workers taking advantage of that in order to transform their workplaces. Okay, but again, the future. And so what I want to sort of tentatively suggest here is that, you know, we're in a moment, I think, of transition in many ways in the larger labor movement, but also here in Iowa City. And in a moment in which we've just seen the legislature in Iowa roll back many protections for workers, including a new law, which is effectively an anti-collective bargaining law, which dismantles much of what was Chapter 20, which allowed those workers at the university to organize. But at the same time, you know, so even though there have been those legal setbacks to that last major phase of organizing here in Iowa City and also in the nation, we're also seeing new innovative experiments in what organizing means. And here in Iowa City, we have the Center for Worker Justice, which has been experimenting with organizing on a community basis, and which perhaps points us in the direction of a new phase of not only Iowa's labor history, but as an example of worker centers across the country, a new phase in the history of the labor movement more generally, in which we recognize the limitations of the old regime of collective bargaining, whether it be founded in the 1930s or the 1970s, and begin to organize in a much broader way that, you know, again, just as in the 1970s, as we saw women and people of color begin to organize in ways that connected the civil rights movement and the women's movement to older traditions of unionism. You know, here we have another moment of innovation amongst the labor movement that is happening. That's happening here in Iowa City, right? That again perhaps points to some new possible future. So again, I want to end there in the hope that we can have a few minutes of conversation and some questions. Thank you very much.
So do we have questions? Wait, hang on. I get to play Vanna White here, so.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what the status is today of the Carpenters Union, and especially with, dealing with illegal hires, and all that sort of thing.
Oh, well, I can't speak well, let me put it this way. So when I wrote this book in 2004, the union the union's history was in doubt because it had always been overshadowed by the Cedar Rapids local. And there had always been these threats that it would be swallowed by the Cedar Rapids local. But what's happened actually in the last decade is that because of all the building here in Iowa City, it's actually become the big, I'm trying to think of the best way to, I mean, it's no longer under threat of being swallowed, let's put it that way. And in fact, it has actually absorbed some other locals in eastern Iowa. So it's shifted its relative position, let's put it that way. But it's also one thing to note that, and I should have said this before, is that it's also been quite a supporter of the Center for Worker Justice. It's a fantastic example of how the building trades can at times embrace these newer forms of unionism. They've been very active in the center and very, like, as I say, expansive in the way that they've approached some of these new problems that the labor movement has confronted.
So maybe you can explain a little bit about what it is different that the Center for Worker Justice does compared to a traditional union that we're more familiar with.
Sure. Well, the way that we're used to thinking of a labor union, right, is that it's grounded in a workplace, right, and that you organize, you have a group of workers, you organize the union, you organize the union amongst those workers in the workplace, you have some form of election, and the government, whether it's the federal government or the state government, gives that union representation over those workers, and they bargain a contract, and then they hopefully are able to continue improving on that contract over the years through negotiations with their employer. What worker centers do is that they've recognized that it's become harder and harder over the years to have that process work. That especially since in the private sector, since the institution of a law called Taft-Hartley, which amended the National Labor Relations Act way back in 1947, in ways that over the years have kind of snowballed and made it very difficult for unions in the private sector to win elections because of all the kinds of limitations they placed on workers in succeeding in that process. Well, one of the innovations of these worker centers is, again, they aren't necessarily workplace centered, but they organize essentially wherever workers are there to be organized. And so, like, for example, some of the campaigns that the Center for Worker Justice has been involved with involve things like wage theft. Not necessarily organizing workers at restaurants, but finding workers at say restaurants who or in other kinds of service employment, especially where employers have failed to pay the compensation that's due, and they've been able to put pressure, public pressure, by building coalitions, public coalitions, community coalitions. They've been able to get back pay for workers through this other process, right? By essentially using well, to put it in a way that was in terms that were developed by some organizers in St. Louis in the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century, to rely upon a community bargaining table, essentially, right, where you bring not just the workers in a workplace together, but all the community members to put leverage on an employer to treat their workers with justice.
So did the 1010 wage come out of the Center for Workers' Justice?
Well, they were certainly very involved in those campaigns. Certainly here in Johnson County, yes, and then we're helpful in having workers in the other counties that were able to enact that higher minimum wage to be successful, through their initiative and experience.
Oh, wait.
Thank you. At the turn of the century and early 20th century, a lot of women's groups, Women's Christians Temperance Union, Women's Consumer League, they would throw their weight behind the workers' situation in the same fashion, and they were very successful. So looks like there's some real history that backs up what they're doing.
Yes. Yeah, the Women's Trade Union League is a
Yes,
good example
that's right,
of this.
that's right, yes.
Yes, exactly. These sort of cross-class institutions that were powerful lobbying institutions for workers. Yeah, exactly.
Asking questions. Does anyone else have, did you have a question? So I lived in Dubuque for a short period, a fairly short period of time. And Dubuque is another one of those places when I called to ask you, or emailed you to ask, that's what I was thinking of about labor history, because there were big strikes there, there were protests. They have, unlike Iowa City, they had an enormous Labor Day parade. And Iowa City doesn't have a Labor Day parade, which I always thought was kind of interesting in that.
They used to.
They used to?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe they will again. But so that's what I was thinking of, was this big town, the town where there was a John Deere plant and they had a packing plant. And I've forgotten where my question was going. Shoot. Oh, so striking. So is there a history of striking in Iowa City where, because I remember protests where University of Iowa buildings were being built and they didn't hire any union employees.
Yes. Yes, and so there have been a variety of job actions, at the very least, in the building trades, especially at university buildings. There was one at the Communication Studies building in the 1980s, if I recall correctly. There was also one. Actually the opposite of a strike, a lockout that happened in Iowa City in the 1920s. The construction contractors wanted to force down wages by the union construction workers, and were ultimately successful in putting enough pressure on the workers that they were able to force down the wages. So there have been both those things.
More questions? You got it? Oh, here, make a statement.
Anybody who's not familiar with the Center for Worker Justice, I suggest you check things out there. I learned a lot about them last week, and they are for the worker. They are for the people who have no protection. Do they, Jen? Yes, they do. But okay. But I suggest everyone in this room check out what they're about. I think they're doing fantastic things for the community.
John, you do most of your research through the minutes, or was the State Historical Society collection in Iowa City?
Well, I was able, a little bit of both. So one of the things about and actually there was a question about the website, the web address for the Center for Worker Justice. I'm looking at it right now. So it's the CWJ Iowa, all one word, .org. So there it is right there. At least in the Carpenters Union, they're required, I don't know if it's a constitutional provision or exactly what it is, but they're required to hang on to their membership or their meeting minutes, and I believe their financial records. So when I went to 1260, they had all these wonderful historical records dating all the way back to the beginning of the Union. And so the way I started writing the book was that I turned to the meeting minutes and I just started reading. And that was a lot of the book, at least the first half, was just reading those things and trying to to supplement them and sort of put them in context by using the other great sources, especially at the State Historical Society. In the second half of the book, though, I was luckily able to turn to this other great resource, which I now work for, ironically, which is the Iowa Labor History Oral Project. So in the 1970s, the Iowa labor movement at the state level realized that that workers don't tend to write down their own history, but of course that workers' history is critically important. And so what they did was they founded and then and financed an oral history project that sent professional historians around the state to do these interviews. And so people like Charlie Rupert, say, for example, he was interviewed back in the 70s or 80s, and so I was able to turn to his interviews with ILHOP in order to write those pieces of the story. And then I did some of the interviews myself as well. My first interview with Dale McCormack took place in 2004. She was living in Maine, so she went off to Maine after living here and actually becomes a figure in Democratic politics in Maine, the first woman state treasurer, I believe, as well. And at any rate, I interviewed her there in Maine, and then was able to, when I got this job, I was able to do the official ILHOP interview with Dale, which is a bit of what you heard today. So again, ILHOP is a critical resource for people who want to do recent labor history in Iowa.
And how can we access those?
And, okay, so it's in flux, but there are approximately 1,250 interviews that have been conducted, about 1,100 of which are available as in analog recordings at the State Historical Society. About 700 of those 1,100 are transcribed. We're right now in the process. We just won a major grant, almost $100,000 grant from the National Historical Records, pardon me, I always get the acronym messed up, National Historical Preservation and Records Commission, in partnership with the UI Libraries and the State Historical Society to digitize all of those 1,100 analog interviews, which will then be joined with the 150 or so born digital interviews that I've done. And then hopefully we'll, in the next year or so, we'll begin to make those available in a way that, that people all over Iowa and around the world can access at least parts of them digitally. This SoundCloud page that I played today, it's just ILHOP, I-L-H-O-P, it's SoundCloud. That's a kind of 0.0 version of what we hope to be able to do on a much grander scale.
Well, that will be a fantastic resource. I mean, to be able to listen to those people who are gone, lots of them.
Yeah, our hope is, I mean, and I think, I honestly don't think this is at all hyperbole, is that I think that we can use that to create not just the most important social history resource for Iowa history, but one of the most important social history resources for the second half of the 20th century around the nation.
Well, we look forward to that. Oh, another question?
No, I was just going to say.
Sorry, I'll walk fast.
First, congratulations on the grant. It's
So thank you.
not
Well,
easy to get. And
I was a very small part of that, I should say.
Well,
very small.
To all of you. That's really important. I'm just reading right now just a fascinating book called Packing House Daughter. I know it's available at Prairie Lights. I hope it's in the library here. I forget her first name, but I think it's Register, and it's about the Albert Lee packing house strike in 1959, and it's very impressive, really impressive. Very easy book to read, but really impressive, and just ties right into everything you've been talking about. So.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a memoir, right? If I recall correctly.
Yes. Her father, divides the town, and she went on from that background, which was so typical of that time of working class union families. She went on to get a PhD and all that sort of thing, and she's sort of revisiting all that, and it's very powerful. I mean, a lot of impressive people like Studs Terkel and others just highly praise it, which is justified.
I agree. I read that as a graduate student, that book, yeah. But I would just say as a follow-up to that, just that one of the things that I've become increasingly convinced of is of the power of these stories, right? Of first-person narratives to be able to make those connections, right? You know, the labor movement finds itself at a crossroads, at a critical place, and I think that one of the things that that might be helpful in this moment, again, is for you know, people who haven't had that personal connection to be able to establish it through those narratives, right? I mean, because there are powerful, powerful stories. You know, that's one of the great great blessings of this job I've had, is to be able to sit down for hours and listen to these powerful stories told by Iowa workers all over this state and outside of the state as well. And again, you know, I'm never I'm often surprised by the new things I discover and by just the sheer power of the narratives of these people who often don't think of themselves as historical actors, but whose lives are powerful testaments to the ability of ordinary, regular people who often just see themselves as going to work every day, but who are themselves powerful historical actors in their own right.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great start to Weber Days.